And I think we talked about this a little bit yesterday. So can we talk about the intersection of neurodiversity and racial diversity? And in your book, there wasn't a whole lot on that subject. And let me see what the question said. I wrote my notes down. I always write notes. Could you talk about why that wasn't discussed a lot and maybe some projects that you've been working on in this area?
Sure. What it is that people of color in the periods of history that I was mostly writing about hardly ever got an autism diagnosis. If your child was autistic, for one thing, I remember I spoke to a clinician who started diagnosing autism based on Leo Connor's work back in the 1940s. So we're talking about old school. Mm-hmm. She told me that most parents who would come to see her to get a diagnosis of autism for their child had already been through 10 therapists by the time they saw her. Can you imagine how limited the access was to an autism diagnosis if you had to be able to afford to have seen 10 therapists by the time you got to her? So there was definitely class and racial discrimination. Also, there are many papers out on the fact that basically if you were an upper middle class white kid back in the, not just the 40s, but the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, you would get a diagnosis of autism if you could afford it for your child. Whereas if you were Black or poor, your child would get a diagnosis of intellectual disability, or as they called it very ableistly then, mental retardation. There's been a lot of what's called diagnostic substitution of kids who were given a diagnosis of intellectual disability, who we now know were almost certainly autistic, and many of them were people of color. So a lot of the periods that I wrote about, there were hardly any people of color who were diagnosed, not none, but hardly any. And in fact, this was such a problem that a very well-known sociologist named Victor Sanua suggested, I believe in the 80s, I think, or maybe the 70s, that people of color were immune to autism. Like, that's how bad the access to diagnostic resources were for people of color. So one might ask, why aren't there more people of color in the very last parts of my book, which cover an era when they could have gotten a diagnosis? And that's a very good question, and I feel bad about that. And what happened was, as I mentioned, my book was originally supposed to be 250 pages. That's what the contract was. I handed it in at 800.
Look at this book here.
Yeah, I handed it in at 8. My editor was like, I thought my editor would think I was nuts, and just drop the contract after 5 years, And what she said was, it's an excellent book, but at 800 pages, no one's going to read it. We have to cut, a bunch of chapters. And we had like a week and a half to do that before it went to the press. So I just said to my editor, who was excellent, Megan, you just suggest what I should cut. She ended up cutting, I believe, 3 chapters from the end. And unfortunately, one of those chapters focused on autistic people of color. And I feel really bad about that. What I did to try to slightly make up for it, although I understand that I didn't totally make up for it, is I wrote an article for a science magazine online called Undark. And my title, the title of my piece is The Invisibility of Black Autism. And so I actually used some of the parts of the book that did not come out in the book in that article. So if anyone wants to know what I think about that, read The Invisibility of Black Autism in Undark.
I'm writing that down, and we'll put a link up to, is that online or?
Yeah, it's online.
Okay, we'll put a link up for the book clubbers to follow that.
Yep.
I think, yeah, it is unfortunate that was one of the chapters left out, because I think that that's, there is a lot of, people of color that are also disabled, they have even, I mean, it's like a multiplier effect of challenges that they face.
It's unbelievable. I mean, you know, and now, well, I don't want to get into the current state of politics, but let's put it this way. Some of the decisions that are being made in Washington are going to make life much worse, both for disabled people and people of color and disabled people of color. So that's a big issue. One of our viewers here said, "Can we get access to the cut chapters?" I'm sorry, I can't do it, but I did publish some of that chapter in that article, the invisibility of Black autism, which someone just posted the link to very helpfully.
I have a feeling one of my moderators is on right now, helping me out. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.